Just to start off, I just wanted to offer some brief introductory remarks about our speaker for today's keynote address. Dr. Michael Bitzer is a professor of politics here at Catawba College. He has been at Catawba since 2002. He is also someone that really has lived a life that meets the interdisciplinary approach that our honors program here at Catawba really tries to instill in our students. So we're really fortunate to have someone that has a very diverse background with a bachelor's in English, a master's in history from Clemson, and a PhD from the University of Georgia in political science. So beyond his really interesting and diverse academic background, I think we all here at Catawba really feel fortunate to have Dr. Bitzer as a faculty colleague. I know it's been a pleasure working with him for almost a decade now in the politics department. But I can tell you that he is really one of the treasures that we have on campus. He's a true public intellectual. And for those of you that don't know him from campus, you probably have heard his voice on the radio at some point or seen him on television. He is very regularly a guest and sometimes a guest host on a range of media formats, both local media outlets as well as international media outlets. Very excited for him. He had a book published just within the past month. I think I saw some pictures on Facebook the other day of his shipment coming in of his new book. It's called Redistricting and Gerrymandering in North Carolina, Battle Lines in the Old North State. So there's many more things I could say about Dr. Bitzer. We're very pleased to have him as our keynote speaker for the conference. And with that, I'll turn it over to him. He's going to be speaking on the Soul of America. And his keynote address really builds on some of the things that he's doing in an honors course he's offering for us this semester. So Dr. Bitzer, thank you very much for being here on Saturday. I know game days in the fall are always difficult, even though we know that you cheer for the wrong teams. So thank you very much for being here today. And I look very much to hearing you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Feeney, and thanks to you and to Dr. Vandergriff Avery for allowing me this opportunity. Yes, if it was scheduled before 3:30 this afternoon, I'd be happy to do it. But after 3:30 till about 6:37, I'm already committed in terms of game viewing. And it is a real honor for me to be able to speak to this group and to this conference. I hope the conference is going well so far and everybody is learning a great deal about different ideas, different topics. One of the things, as Dr. Feeney mentioned, is I'm teaching a course called The Divided Soul of America. And I'm going to share just a real overview of some of the key things that we are talking about in the class and that I think is relevant particularly for today's environment that we find ourselves in. And so for the course, what I do is structure it around 4 key questions. And I think this is going to be kind of the heart of what I'm going to be sharing with you all today. This is very much an abbreviation of what we are spending 15 weeks trying to think about and to discover and to contemplate. I also teach a course on polarization in US politics. And again, that's 15 weeks of trying to understand this idea of division and polarization in our society. So these are really going to be kind of touching on some key big ideas, but certainly I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards and try and get a little bit more into the meat of things. The first question is probably the most basic, the most fundamental. What are the principles, the values, the ideals of what makes up the soul of America? And we can certainly talk about and debate whether America has a soul. But I'm going under the assumption that we do, as a historian and political scientist of American history and politics. I like to think of us as we do have this thing called a soul of America. The second question is, how does our identity impact and affect the soul of America? Third, how did we get to this level of division and polarization? Just briefly, we have always been divided. But most political scientists, a lot of historians have been looking back over time and realize that in our current situation, we are as divided, if not slightly more divided politically than we were before the advent of the American Civil War in 1860. Wow. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Then finally, what, if anything, can be done to address this division, to hopefully repair the break in America's soul? So these are going to be the 4 questions I want to posit to you during this keynote address, and then we can open it up to questions, potential answers as well. So thinking about the principles, the values, the ideals, I think we can all agree on kind of the classic ideals coming out of the Declaration of Independence. All are created equal. Certainly the phrase all men are created equal, but I think in this day and age, recognizing that all are created equal is a fundamental principle, value, ideal that we carry as Americans. The notion of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the goal, this is what we aspire to. This is our dream. Part of it is also the equal protection of the law, that we should all be treated fairly in order to create that equality, to allow us to pursue that goal, that vision, that dream of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Certainly a principle is that we are a democratic system. We, the people, are sovereign, but we are in a republican structure of governance, meaning we hand over power to those who we elect to do our bidding, to seek and to achieve our goals, our vision, our dreams for what America is. Now, there's a real unique aspect to what I consider to be about political power, and that is we divide governing power because we are fearful of human nature. I think so much of what I've been wrestling with and trying to understand is this based on principle of how are human beings quantified, how are they developed, how are they in our nature, what makes us who we are. And we have always had a fear of too much power being accumulated by one individual, one branch of government. So we create the most inefficient form of government. That's a basic principle. If we wanted efficiency, we'd give it all over to one person. But one of our principles, one of our ideals is that we divide up governing power because we are concerned about what human beings can do with that. We have a continuing conversation. And this is really captured, I think, in the preamble to the US Constitution, that our mission, that our goal is to form a more perfect union. And as a former English major, I feel very strongly that words matter. Language imparts key ideas. And the notion that we, as the framers, want to form a more perfect union does not mean we want to form the perfect union. There's a qualifier, recognizing that we as human beings are frail, that we do have faults, but we can strive towards more perfect union as a goal. And then finally, the way that I look at it, having studied it for some time, is that our soul is actually a paradox. It's divided. We have beliefs in ideals. We have these dreams, these aspirations, but oftentimes we are slow to realize their reality, the ideal's reality. And so kind of thinking about in the big picture, this is how I would frame what the principles and values of who we are that makes up the soul of America. Moving on to the next question, how does our identity impact and affect the soul of America? Again, the ideal. American identity is often bound to these basic principles. We can argue over how to construct them, how to best implement them, but really all of us, I think, would agree with those basic principles. The reality is Americans have always been factionalized. Go back to the founding of the Republic. In fact, go back even further to the Articles of Confederation. We had factions then. Madison noted in the Federalist Papers, the endearing quality of human nature is to become factions, us versus them. It can be over religion, race, gender, economics. They noted in the Federalist Papers, property was a source of factionalization. So Americans have always been divided. Americans have always found themselves in this factional dynamic. The uniqueness, I would say, of the 1930s to the 1950s was that there was a general consensus among all of us that we look back to and say, this is what we want to get back towards. This is the kind of unity that we had. But the unity was around two of the most devastating events in American history. Certainly the Civil War was one, but the Great Depression and then World War II really brought the country together to try and battle external forces and create a sense of unity. That uniqueness is fairly rare, I would argue, in American history. But by the 1960s, coming out of that consensus period, we confront the ideals with the reality of who America is. What is our identity, and how is that matching up to the continued questions and the realities of our factionalized America? And by the 1970s, and I note that this is kind of the beginning of the modern time period for our division, the American identity became frayed. Now, it was due to a great many factors: economics, race, gender, sexual orientation. One scholar notes that there was the loss of cross-cutting identities that tended in one person to cut across particularly political boundaries. That loss of cross-cutting identities, I think, has been an important component, along with all of the other factors, that has really impacted who we are as an American, as Americans. And so what I would contend is that our identities have become sordid. Now, politically, we are divided. But if you look at questions based on policies, oftentimes Americans overwhelmingly agree on some basic policies. It is our political identity that has become sordid. We have gone into our respective camps, into our respective tribes, and that creates the polarization and the division that we see. So how exactly did we get to this level of division and polarization? Well, in 1950, the American Political Science Association wrote a major report about political parties in America. And they said basically, and I'm paraphrasing it, but this is their basic summation: there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two major parties, between Republicans and Democrats. And we can see that in the data from the 1950s. This is a set of analyses that basically takes votes on economic issues in the US House of Representatives and then in the US Senate, and kind of classifies the different representatives based on their political party, Democrats on top, the Republicans on the bottom part of the graph, to say, how are they liberal? How are they moderates? How are they more conservatives within each political party? And in 1955, you find a pretty significant chunk of Democrats in that middle area, the moderates, the conservative Democrats. Same thing for Republicans. You find a significant number of Republicans in the US House placing themselves in the moderate area. In fact, there are some Republicans that were more liberal than Democrats, and some Democrats that were more conservative than some Republicans. Fast forward now nearly 70 years to today's dynamics in terms of what we see in the House for Democrats and in the House for Republicans. The collapse of the middle. The moderates have gone away. There are very few members that overlap with each other. Now, a lot of people would argue, well, this is because of redistricting and gerrymandering. Well, that could be potentially a part of it. But since we have a US Senate that is not based on the dynamics of districting, that it is based on a sense of statewide dynamics. You see in the 1950s, Democrats, again, significant number of them in the middle, some very much more conservative. Then we have Republicans in the middle again. But you go ahead to today's current dynamics, very few Democrats who are moderates, very few, if any, Republicans who are moderates. So at the elite level, for both issues in terms of the elected officials, our parties have polarized themselves. But it's not just the elites, it's us as well. And in looking at the American National Election Study of 2020's presidential election, they asked the question of how do you identify with a political party, Republican, Democratic, or independent? They asked the partisans, are you a strong partisan or a not very strong partisan? For those who identify as independents, well, do you lean to one party or do you lean to the other? I would point to the pure independents and the number that I've circled here at the bottom of the screen. In the American electorate in 2020, only 8% of voters identified as a pure independent. And that is, kind of contrary to what we think of the massive moderate middle. There is no real middle when 90% of the electorate basically identifies with one political party over the other. And in fact, based on strong partisanship, those folks who identify as either strong Democrats or strong Republicans, almost 100% of them are voting for their party. But when you move into the not strong partisans, nearly 80% plus are voting for their party. What's interesting to me is the independents who say they lean to one party over the other. They are just as partisan as those folks who identify as a member of a political party. It's when you get into the less than 10% crowd that is an even split. So we, the voters, we, the American people, have sorted ourselves and our party loyalists. And in fact, when in 2012, there was the question asked, is there anything that you like about your party and the opposition? Well, for Democrats, 60% or greater said yes, there was something that they liked about their political party. Less than a third, particularly among strong partisans, only 13% said there was something that they liked about the Republican Party. On the other side of the aisle, the exact same dynamic. Strong Republicans, 88% said that they liked something about the Republican Party. Only 18% said they liked something about the Democratic Party. The folks in the middle, a quarter or less said there was something that they liked about either party. And this pattern has extended from 2012 into 2016 and into 2020. So this dynamic of liking your party but disliking the other party is part of what we call negative partisanship or affective polarization that is going on in the American political environment. In North Carolina, since this is a North Carolina-based conference, I wanted to give you a little sense of what the state is looking like. Very much so, the state of North Carolina is pretty much evenly divided. In the presidential election of 2020, it was a 51-49 split between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But if you look geographically into the regions, those areas that are central cities, the people that live in the Charlottes, the Raleighs, the Winston-Salems, the Ashevilles, overwhelmingly voted for Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton. When you get into the urban suburbs, those areas outside of the central city, but inside of an urban county like Mecklenburg and Wake and Guilford, very evenly divided in 2016, a little more Republican in 2020. You move into the outer suburbs, the surrounding suburban counties, among the most Republican in the state. And then finally, the rural counties are slightly less Republican, slightly more Democratic than the surrounding suburban counties, but still very much a Republican-oriented area. One of the key questions that I ask is, how does this then play out in a variety of different political dynamics? And what we see is precinct polarization, thinking that we should see a kind of normal bell curve. If we classified all of the precincts across the state and said, well, this precinct voted overwhelmingly greater than 60% Republican or Democratic, that's a strong precinct. But maybe there are some precincts that are competitive, voted 50 to 54% for either party. Well, in 2016, in North Carolina, it was very much a reverse bell curve. Over 70% of the precincts across North Carolina voted for one party over the other. Less than 15% were competitive. We have sorted ourselves. And that trend continued in 2020. Again, 70% voted overwhelmingly for one party. Less than 15% were competitive areas. So we live amongst like-minded individuals. We vote like-minded with our neighbors, and we find it hard to be able to understand where other people are coming from. And this dynamic is very much played out in the urban-rural divide. In 2016, 67%, 2/3 of all the central city precincts voted overwhelmingly for for Hillary Clinton. In 2020, that number went up to 3/4. You then move into the rural counties of North Carolina. 60% voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. Again, almost 60% 4 years later in 2020. This, to me, is a pure sign of the urban-rural divide in this state. Now, to think about in terms of other aspects, and let's see, slideshow has moved up here. Here we go. Going back to the question of division and polarization, nearly 70 years later, our parties are nationalized. They are unified. They are coherent, and they are very disciplined. There's more than a dime's worth of difference between the two major parties right now. But there was a warning in the 1950 report that said, if you have unified, disciplined, and responsible parties that are appropriate only to a government that seeks to fully locate power in the hands of popular majorities. One of the key principles, one of the key values that America has is that we have majority rule, but we should respect the rights of minorities. And that requires veto points. This is where gridlock ensues in our system. And so thinking about beyond just this division of polarization and how we can conceivably get to it, what can be done to repair the break in America's soul? In the class, I'm using a book by a gentleman by the name of Robert Putnam. He wrote a book in early 2000s called Bowling Alone. And it talked about the fact that America was basically isolating themselves, that we were losing the idea of social capital. He's written a follow-up book to it that we'll be using at the end of the semester called The Upswing. And here he notes that America basically goes through periods of I versus we. And we are currently in an I period. It's all about me. It's all about the individual. But he points back to the Gilded Age and the progressive era that followed after that to say America came together under similar circumstances, and we were able to basically repair the break of America's soul. And a lot of political scientists have been asking, and people have been commenting about how to address this division. Well, one of them is to call out your own tribe. When your political party makes questionable statements, call them out, take them to task. Part of the issue that I have is that it's easier said than done because of group dynamics and individual behavior. Social psychology tells us a lot about individual behavior, and oftentimes we want to fit into the group. We don't want to break with the group that we belong to. You can downplay the fringes, play up the middle. Well, as we've seen, it's easier said than done when less than 10% of Americans identify as pure independents. Understand and respect differing viewpoints. Here we're talking about the idea of trying to see the other side. But the real question I have is, what if those views are antithetical to basic American values, principles, and beliefs? Should we respect those types of ideas that break with our norms of American basic principles? We may have to recognize that ultimately we are predisposed to our own tribal instincts and our own patterns. I recently read a book called Predisposed that takes the idea that perhaps there is a biological dynamic to our political differences. It's a controversial idea, but they make a convincing case that at some point we have to recognize that perhaps these dispositions, these ideas are already baked into our human nature. And then what I would end with in terms of what can be done is a simple list of recognizing where we are in America today. We're in a generational tectonic shift, boomers versus millennials. This is going to be a pattern that's going to be with us for some time, but the dynamics are definitely going to shift into the future. We're also in an economic tectonic shift. We've gone from the farm to the factory, now to the digital age. That's continuing to have an issue. We are in a demographic tectonic shift. The US Census from last year points to the continued diversification of the country, the likes we have never seen before in our history. We are advancing, but we are always incurring backlashes as we have in American history. And then finally, we have to recognize and reckon with the past towards achieving what I described at the beginning, the sense of trying to bring about a more perfect union. So in answer to the questions that I posed at the beginning, America's ideals are easy to determine. They are oftentimes fought over to try and explore who belongs to America, but ultimately the difficulty comes about in trying to realize those ideals. America's identity has always been divided, but nowadays it's our political identity that's deeply divided. And that is thanks to the idea of the tribal me versus the collective we. How did we get to this level of division? It's taken us 50 years to sort into these respective camps due to a host of dynamic factors. We're not going to solve this overnight. It's going to be a slow, incremental process. And then finally, what can be done to address the division? Well, for the students on this, in this address, I'm looking at you. It's up to you to try and repair the breach. But recognize that if we, the people, want to continue towards that more perfect union, that is the responsibility ultimately for being an American. So with that, I thank you for your time and attention. I'm at 30 minutes, so we will throw it open to questions and possible answers.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Bitzer. I know I've written down lots of questions, but I'd like to open it up to other folks that don't get to ask you these questions every day at work. So the way we'll manage it, since we have a number of participants in this chat, if you could just type a question in the chat box, then I'll deliver those questions to Dr. Bitzer as well. But it's definitely a very timely message. While folks are typing in their questions, I'll just mention, Dr. Bitzer, you might find this interesting. One of the panels that I've moderated this morning, student presentations, a student from UNC Greensboro, Caroline Malloy, actually had a research project where she looked at evaluations of facial trustworthiness and looked at how putting like a label of Democrat or Republican over these faces. I'm gonna butcher her project, but my understanding of it is that essentially what we found is that just by putting a label or a caption on the photo of Democrat or Republican really did move the needle quite a bit in terms of how respondents evaluated the trustworthiness of a person. And that really, I think, goes to the point that you have here, that we really have sorted ourselves in a lot of ways. And maybe some of the things in the predisposed book, there's some things baked into us as human beings that really lead us to these divisions. So I do have the first question for the audience.
Sure.
And this is from Dyke Messenger, and he said that he recently read that politics flows from culture, and wanted to know if you could comment a little bit on this idea that the origin of our politics is really our culture, our society.
Sure. I think that is a critical component to trying to understand where we are right now. I think if you look back over history, cultural dynamics always has a play in terms of what our thinking about government, what should be the role of government. I think cultural dynamics, particularly things like religious affiliation and belief systems, have been at the core of who and what we are. We are certainly in, if you take just, for example, religious dimensions, we have seen that play out in the great awakenings, oftentimes of early colonial period in American history. And certainly the dynamic of religion is an important component of who and what we are as Americans. Culture can certainly define and tell us what our symbols are, what our belief systems are. Whenever I teach state politics, I oftentimes start the class off by talking about what is the culture of all the states. I mean, a state like North Carolina has a very different culture from South Carolina. A state like New York has a different culture than a state like Texas. We develop these kinds of attitudes and belief systems and then transpose them onto, well, what is our belief system about how government should behave? What should be the role of government? Is it a individualistic, or is it a kind of moralistic, community-based dynamic? Or is it a traditionalistic approach where the elites of society should have the ultimate say and we, the masses, should just follow what the elites tell us to because they know what's best? This notion of culture, I think has become part of the polarization, along with economics, along with race, a whole host of things. So whenever I hear somebody say, well, it's just economics, or it's just politics, or it's just something that's fairly finite, I have to think, well, all of these factors play together and have an influence and can be influenced by what we are seeing play out. So I think, not to get too deep into the weeds, but I think culture does play a role in all of this, but it is very much a relationship driven by all of these other factors that have led us to this point.
All right, thank you very much. The next question is from Dr. Paciali, and you can feel free to chime in if I misframe your question. But the question is, to what extent is this polarization of U.S. politics reflecting a tendency of polarization in international politics? So I know, like, I'm a comparativist and an international relations political scientist. And we do see sort of this division really rising in lots of countries. So the German election, where we're waiting on results right now, we do see sort of like this division of society and this tendency of at least electoral politics in a lot of core democracies in the Western world reflecting the same types of tendencies. Is there something that's really about sort of a global movement, or is this purely like an American or North Carolina phenomenon?
Well, I will admit and acknowledge up front, I'm not an internationalist. So I have to be careful in terms of making sweeping statements about outside of our borders. I leave that to my distinguished colleague, Dr. Feeney, to figure out everybody else's issue. Interestingly enough, though, I was re-listening to a podcast yesterday, and they had a guest on who is a professor of political science in Israel. And what he has written is a recent book that I have not read yet, but I'm dying to get my hands on, in terms of talking about American polarization and how that fits into international politics. Are we seeing this kind of phenomenon play out, or is the United States relatively unique or exceptional in this level of polarization? And his argument in particularly Western democracies is that the United States is not unique, that we are seeing this rise, particularly in terms of dynamics of the politics of the right, moving more nationalistic, moving more authoritarianism. I think, in a very superficial way, looking at countries like Poland, looking at countries like Hungary, we see this kind of dynamic of polarization coming out, and the brute strength of authoritarianism playing itself out more and more in the dynamics. So I'm not going to claim to be an expert. I can only speak to American politics, but my sense is that we are seeing it play out in other fields based on what I understand from other experts on that particular dynamic.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think the question's a good one, because it sort of gives us an idea. Okay, is there something about this sort of era that's impacting all of these countries similarly, or is it sort of following the leader? Is it like adopting one style of electoral politics and just sort of copying that in multiple places? Mm-hmm. I think that, the fact that we might see some trends, the same types of things are playing out, really opens us up to some possibilities in terms of other factors that might matter. I would like to pivot to Dr. Vandergrift Avery's question.
Sure.
She says, your point about reckoning with the past being an essential component of moving forward and reconnecting with one another is important. But how exactly do we encourage the collective we to reckon with our complicated and problematic history and past? So, I think this is a really good question. Some of this is like hard work, where we have to look at ourselves and hold up the mirror. That's not a great thing. So how do we build this idea of a collective we when we have a history that is not really reflected a collective we? If I've paraphrased adequately, Dr. VA, you can chime in.
I think that this is, in my mind, the fundamental issue that we have to confront. We have to acknowledge it. And I had been thinking about this class, and this goes to the reason that I'm teaching the class. For many years now, I've heard people argue in politics, particularly, about how they know American history and this was never the case or this happened. And I think, well, we can disagree in terms of our opinions. We cannot disagree on the facts that we know, and we continue to learn about issues that we did in American history, that we as Americans have to acknowledge both the rights and the wrongs that have been done in our society. And I think that there is a time when one side wants to promote positive values, positive beliefs, the positivity of America, but they will never willingly acknowledge the wrongs that were committed at the same time. And that's why I kind of like to use I use the term divided, but I also like the term paradoxical soul, because there's a paradox in promoting those values and ideas, but recognizing the reality that we oftentimes failed to achieve those ideals and those goals and those aspirations. There has to be a reckoning, and there has to be honest conversations, and there has to be a willingness to listen. I think for so much of what we are dealing with now, people have isolated themselves, they've siloed themselves, they only hear what reinforces and confirms their biases. And I think the point of what I've been trying to stress, particularly in my class, is let's hear from different views. Let's read common ideas. Let's read common writings and speeches, and then try and put them into the context of what was going on at the time. We as Americans recognize that we are flawed beings by being human. Let's accept that. Let's learn from that. And let's try and move towards that notion of being a more perfect union, recognizing we can't be perfect. I can't be perfect. Nobody can be perfect. But let's at least acknowledge it, learn from it, and try not to make the same mistakes yet again and again and again.
All right, thank you very much. And I appreciate the time you've taken. And I have one final question.
Sure.
It relates sort of tangentially to this, this idea that we have to sort of acknowledge facts. I know, like, the fact that we were polarized was something I did not want to acknowledge for a long time as a non-American political scientist. I'd be like, no, we just make a big deal about it. But this one is from a student, Angel Ankrum. And she would like to know what books you would recommend to students so they could be more aware of our division and polarization, either sort of like what the track record is, which your presentation was fairly informative, but also maybe the causes and consequences of that.
Boy, the first thing I will do is, if folks want a copy of my syllabus, I just put in my email address. Send me an email. I will be happy to send you the list of readings that I'm covering, along with the readings that I do in the polarization seminar. I think the first set of readings that I would truly recommend is something that we just finished in the class. And that is a set of historical and contemporary readings. Read the Declaration of Independence, read the Constitution, read some of the Federalist Papers, but then read things like Washington's farewell address. Read the Gettysburg Address. Read Alexander Stevens, the former vice president of the Confederacy, the Confederated States of America, his cornerstone speech. Read Susan B. Anthony. Read W.E.B. Du Bois, writings. Ground yourself in some of the historical readings and ideas about America. And then for specifically on polarization, again, some of the core texts that I'm reading, I've got one right in front of me here, a book called Uncivil Agreement. And it's about how our identity has become politically based. It's probably one of the most important books in American politics in the past decade, because it is short, it is sweet, but it brings so much together to understanding how our identities have shifted and morphed. The other thing I would say is read multiple authors on the same topic. Whenever I teach the polarization seminar, we start off by reading 3 different political scientists who have 3 different ideas about polarization. And the students have to work together and figure out for themselves what it is to be polarized. And I think that that's important. Read American history, but read different perspectives. Read different viewpoints about American history. Pull them together, and you get the sense of this is complicated, this is hard, this is all over the place, but that's what America is.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Bitzer. And
it's been my pleasure.
With that, we'll conclude the Q&A. But again, your topic was really relevant, I think, for all of us here in the room as just citizens, that really have to engage with our political system. It also is really relevant for our topic of re-engaging communities, and this really asks us to do a couple of things. One, and that's like truly engage with our past as a community, and really look into what it means to be an American, and what America has done and the directions we've gone. But it also is like a call. I think some of the things we saw in the polarization data that you gave us really showed us that a lot of it has to do with sort of, as you put it, siloing ourselves from one another. And this lack of engagement really becomes a problem for American political, the American political system. So thank you very, very much. It's always an informed conversation. I always learn a great deal listening to you talk about polarization in America. And we hope that you enjoy the football later today.
Good luck with the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.